Welcome to ICN Sunday Morning. I'm Vernon Loeb, Executive Editor. The Endangered Species Act is under assault by the Trump administration. Trump's Interior Secretary Doug Burgum calls it the Hotel California, citing a lyric from the iconic Eagles song, "You can check out anytime you'd like, but you can never leave," meaning that species who get on the list never come off the list. It was a good post on X for Burgum, a nice soundbite. Needless to say, it's not true. It's a gross oversimplification of what's going on with the Endangered Species Act. Joining me this morning to talk about that is Kiley Price, who's just started a new conservation beat for us and has a story on the site this morning about Trump's assault on the Endangered Species Act. For Kiley, this is a real passion play. Kiley, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me on.
So explain to us why species are slow to come off the endangered species list.
Yeah, there are quite a few reasons for this. So basically, a lot of the US government's plan around endangered species conservation is surrounding the Endangered Species Act. Um, and some people have criticisms, like the Trump administration, that the act itself is the reason that endangered species are not recovering. But a lot of people that I have spoken with, including scientists, legal experts, environmental groups, they point to two big factors which pretty much resonate across all environmental laws, which are money and politics. Money is a big one for endangered species because they don't get much funding. Conservation in general in the US does not get much funding in comparison to the number of species that are endangered. So this is a big reason that researchers have found not enough money has been dedicated to doing these restoration efforts. So that means like maybe restoring wetlands that an endangered bird lives in. It takes a lot of funding. Another reason is politics. And so that can come down to which species are protected and when. So when a species is listed, it's basically granted certain protections by the federal government. But the listing process itself can take many years. And during that time, so when a proposal happens, a lot of species are already in dire straits before they're even listed. And if you have a process that takes many years, that species is still exposed to those threats throughout that process. So this can be a huge problem because from start to finish, like, okay, finally the endangered species is declared endangered. It might be like 10 individuals left in the species, and it's really hard to recover once it reaches those small levels.
Yeah, so it's not really only slow to come off, it's slow to get on in the first place.
Absolutely. These legal battles can get really intense, and anybody can propose to list a species. So it is one of the more litigious environmental laws, and it's partially for that very reason, and it's partially because businesses, it does offer a lot of regulations for them, so that can be difficult.
Yeah. Now, of course, Doug Burgum, in his comparison to the Hotel California, was a little too glib. Species have, in fact, come off the list. I think the number, reading your story, the number is 54, to be exact. So tell us about maybe the most famous case of a species coming off the list.
Yeah. So one slight thing with that is that's 54 species that have been able to recover to come off the list. Unfortunately, there are some that have come off for the much more tragic reason, which is extinction. But on that front, more have come off because they have recovered. So that's that 54 number right there, which is very exciting for a lot of conservationists. But yes, one of the marquee species that is one of the success stories of the Endangered Species Act, according to a lot of experts, is America's bird, which is the bald eagle. So bald eagles in roughly like the 1960s, I would say, were actually incredibly low in population size. This comes after years of habitat loss, but it also largely is because of the pesticide DDT, which Rachel Carson actually wrote about in her book Silent Spring. But there were these findings which found that bald eagles and other birds, when they were exposed to DDT, the shell of their egg became a lot more brittle. So reproduction was really deeply affected, and they would end up sitting on the egg and it would not be able to incubate till for full term, which is really sad. Um, so there was a law that was passed to outlaw DDT and the use of it. Kind of a difficult law to implement. So a lot of experts say that the Endangered Species Act, once the bald eagle was listed, helped to implement that law because it's kind of, people call the ESA like a blunt instrument because of how firm regulations are related to it. But other things that the ESA did in that scenario were helping with habitat loss, helping reintroduce bald eagles to certain areas. There's these thing called captive breeding programs where conservation groups or zoos or other scientists will actually rear bald eagles or other animals in captive settings and then be able to reintroduce them into the wild. Not always possible depending on the animal, but it has seen a lot of success for endangered birds. So eventually, I think it was 2007, yes, bald eagles came off the list because they were able to recover to the point of 10,000 nesting pairs. And that's after in the 1960s, they were down to 417 nesting pairs. So that is a huge recovery just in a couple decades. And that's largely because of the funding and the support that was dedicated to the bald eagle during that.
Yeah. So what specifically has the Trump administration proposed doing to the Endangered Species Act thus far that would weaken protections for species?
That's going to be a long answer. Very multifaceted attack on the Endangered Species Act throughout the past couple of months since Trump has entered office. And this wasn't surprising to many because during Trump's first term, the ESA was a target and has been a target over many terms of conservative presidents and even some Democratic presidents. And that's largely due to what we were talking about earlier, which is that it can introduce some regulatory mechanisms that might inhibit development, but for the very reason of making sure that species don't go extinct. So basically, there have been a couple approaches to undermine the ESA. One of the big ones recently, so in April, the Trump administration, through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, proposed to change something called the harm ruling, which is a part of the ESA that talks about obviously, if there's an endangered species, you can't just outright kill it. And that's something like shooting it or something like that. That's a bit more obvious. The harm ruling encompasses a little bit more complicated of a factor, which is anything that can lead to an animal's or a plant's death. And so the biggest driver of extinction researchers have found is actually habitat loss. So rather than just hunting, just as a whole is habitat loss. So the harm ruling was often invoked to try to protect endangered species in the way of protecting their habitat. So as you can imagine, for businesses, this can get a little bit complicated because they might be developing, like a timber company, for example, might want to log in a certain area, but let's say that area has northern spotted owls in it, which this is a problem in California. It's caused a huge point of tension between timber companies and environmentalists who are saying that northern spotted owls need certain environments to be able to nest, and that's old growth forests. So that's very desirable for these timber companies. So what this new proposed ruling is basically trying to redefine, and the agency can do that potentially, redefine what harm means. So it wouldn't be like a formal like law change. It would more just be a change in how we interpret the law. So that's a big one, very esoteric, obviously, can
And
get.
is this in effect or is this in a comment period or
There
where
was
is
a
it right
comment
now?
period. Yeah, so that period is now over and we're just keeping an eye on what's going to happen now. So it's in this up in flux period, but I've heard from some folks that, things could be happening soon on this front. And
And
then
then presumably it would be litigated?
yeah, yeah.
Right.
just as most things for the ESA are litigated.
Mhm.
So yes, you can see that potentially happening with a lot of environmental groups who are basically watchdogs on all things ESA. Sometimes the ESA too is used not just as a tool to protect an animal or plant, but also as a tool to protect an entire ecosystem or wetlands or water rights or things like that. So it gets really complicated. It gets very tense among different communities. But other things that the Trump administration has done, the ESA has been invoked in several executive orders, mostly related to fossil fuel development and timber, so logging. And this way is quite interesting because it's affected, but like it has the potential to affect a lot of environmental laws. So NEPA, the Clean Water Act. Um, Basically, what these executive orders are proposing is to allow certain projects to be able to bypass or basically streamline. So hop into, I like to call it like a fast pass lane, when you're at an amusement park or something like that. Hop into the fast pass lane and kind of stream right through these environmental reviews, and that includes endangered species protections. So a lot of experts have told me that this is really risky, and if you don't do these environmental reviews, which can take a couple months, a year, there's a reason it takes that long because of the steps that you have to go through. But if you don't do this, it could really affect the entire species population. And then one other thing I wanted to point out, which is quite interesting, and it's only been invoked a few times in history of the ESA. There was this carve-out ruling a couple decades, or I think it was a couple years after the ESA was first enacted. Um, it's a committee that can be invoked when there is a certain situation where a species is declared endangered, but there might be a project that is deemed so important to humanity that it has to go through anyways. Um, it's only been invoked a couple times because it's a lot of heavy hitters in the government. So Secretary of the Interior is part of that group and a couple other committees. And people call it the God Squad because it's essentially playing God, as some people say, um, deciding which species gets to survive as humanity. Um, it hasn't really been an effective tool in the past for making sure that a project can go through and like talk about litigation. That's the kind of thing that gets pretty pummeled in the courts. But it can give the power to the federal government to decide to basically, even if something has been deemed endangered and that a certain activity will affect it, it can still go through. So a couple of Trump's executive orders have referenced this committee, and that's got some legal experts pretty concerned.
Yeah. Have they convened the God Squad yet, or
Not
what?
that I've seen, at least not publicly.
Yeah. Yeah. I was
I mean,
wondering whether.
there's a lot happening all the time with the federal government right now. So some people have told me even like they can't even see groups getting together, like having the time to get together to talk about things like endangered species.
Right, right. So it kind of seems like the real issue that the Trump administration has with the Endangered Species Act is it slows down development, and in some cases, it infringes on property rights and landowners' rights to use their land however they see fit. But stepping back, um, has the has the Endangered Species Act worked? Has it been effective in protecting species? What do the scientists or what does the science say on that question?
Yeah. I would say largely consensus among scientists and among legal experts is that it has worked for the job that's it's intended to work for, at least the law itself. Obviously, there's been issues with funding and political flip-flopping. So basically, when a species goes on the list and then in a future administration might go off the list and then it might go back on, and that's what we're seeing right now with wolves, gray wolves, but in certain populations. But I would say as a whole, I mean, the key statistic that some of the legal experts I spoke with was that since the law has passed, just 26 listed species have gone extinct. And that's among thousands that have been listed. Um, and so that's that key right there is preventing extinction. So while
Mhm.
recovery is a really difficult process, that's partially because of the time that it takes, to maintain a species and also to address the thing that led them to such low levels in the first place. It's
Yeah,
a fundamental part of society that has led them to this space that they're in. But that being said, like having only 26 species gone extinct, it's a tragic thing. But a lot of people have told me that that probably pales in comparison to what could have happened. Um, had the law and other environmental laws not been enacted. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely got its flaws, according to the people that I spoke with, and I'm sure that those will continue to play out throughout the Trump administration and future administrations. This has not just been an issue under Trump, which some of the papers I have referenced in the past have pointed out, this has been a long-standing problem in the US where it's just there is almost no funding that goes towards protecting wildlife and plants.
yeah, and I guess that's one of the obvious things the government could do moving forward, and that is provide more funding for habitat protections and so on
Mhm.
related to species protection.
Yeah, definitely is what a lot of people would say is like being able to develop the science here. So, figure out what endangered species, like different characteristics about them and what could potentially help their recovery. That's a big one. And then another big one, like you mentioned earlier, is private land ownership. So, I think it's upwards of 80% of endangered species are at least found somewhere on private land. And that's where things get tricky with the ESA. That's one of the big flaws that people point out. But one of the solutions that has been proposed is working with private landowners. So rather than just having sticks, have carrots too. So have incentives that go toward private landowners, like give them a reason. Obviously you're running a business, you want to make money. Give them a reason to protect these species and not just see them as a thorn in their side.
Yeah, yeah. So we've been talking really sort of legalistically about the act and about species. Um, but you've written a lot about the right whales and how few right whales there are left in the Atlantic. Um, Personally, I feel really deeply saddened when I think about the loss of something like a whale. I know you feel the same way. To think about the world without lions and tigers and rhinos and polar bears and a lot of the other very charismatic animals that are threatened. I think Jane Goodall, the British primate scientist, talks about species loss not just as an ecological loss, but as a moral failing, as a moral loss. Um, I've been asking people to do this. Give us something we can feel hopeful about, something we can focus on and sort of be motivated and inspired by going forward in terms of the extinction crisis we're in right now and the quest to save species, in the context of the current administration and the current environment where plenty of people are more than happy to proceed at species expense, at animals expense.
Mhm.
Give me
Yeah.
something to give me something to feel hopeful about.
Yeah. Yeah. Probably one of the more difficult questions that you've asked, but I still have a lot of hope. I write about a lot of these situations that are sad, but I also get to talk to so many people who have dedicated their lives and careers to a single animal or a single plant, and you can see and hear the passion in their eyes and what they say. And it's really amazing. Like someone like Jane Goodall, who has just dedicated her life to studying animals and trying to protect them, or, David Attenborough, obviously the big ones. But also there are people out there every single day, not getting paid very well, but just spending all of their time trying to protect animals and wildlife and nature. That's very inspiring to me. But another thing that is inspiring to me is getting outside and seeing it for myself. Just the other day, I was in Cape Cod and I was able to see a huge aggregation of humpback whales. And it was almost reinvigorating to me as somebody who writes about this pretty consistency to see like what's still out there and why it's so amazing and why I've gotten into this in the first place. And then one more thing I wanted to point out, which has inspired me a lot lately, is a lot of our readers, like hearing from them. I write our newsletter, and we started this new feature called Postcards From, and people are sending in postcards from different places where they're from or where they visited. And the passion is so clear for, and the love of the world that's coming through. It's just, it's very nice for me to see and to know that people are also reading our stuff and our work, and they're the reason that we're doing this work. There was a study that came out recently about how, it's really showing in the science community too, how there's this app called iNaturalist. It's one of these citizen science apps where you can take a picture of an animal or a plant that you might see while you're just out exploring, even in the city. Like if I took a picture of a rat, which I'm in I'm in New York City right now, so they are in abundance. You can take a picture of them, and scientists will go in and actually identify that animal and will use it in their papers. So this new study that came out found that there were thousands of references to iNaturalist data in their papers, and that's from people just uploading it on their own. So the world has mobilized this brigade of citizen scientists who are filling in a lot of these gaps that can be left behind by the government or even by universities. So it's really exciting to me to see the momentum behind the environmental movement that's still there, even after facing a lot of, losses and hardships in the past few months/years.
Yeah, yeah. Your passion and your energy is really coming through right now as you speak.
Okay.
And it's so true. I was on vacation in Hawaii this year, and we went snorkeling, and there were dolphins swimming around our boat, and snorkeling, I saw a giant sea turtle, there in the water, and it was thrilling, as you say.
Yeah.
And I'm so glad you stayed on us and made the case for a conservation beat, which you are now so ably occupying. And I want you to come back sometime soon and talk about right whales and the reporting you've done there, and the work that's going on to try to protect them, and the debate between them and the lobstermen. It's something you've really mastered, but I know you really feel passionately about. So yeah, let's do that.
Absolutely. I'd love to. I believe me, as you can tell, I love talking about this. So anytime.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Vernon.
Yep, and thanks to all of you for watching, for reading Inside Climate News, and supporting what we're doing.